All right, I guess it's time to start. I'm talking about nuclear power in a country that has no nuclear power. Because I think it passed a law in 1985 that said, nope, we're not going to do this because you don't need to. Because you got all that shallow water offshore that you can fill up with windmills and make your electricity that way. But not every country is lucky as you. My name is Richard Campbell. I live in British Columbia in Canada, where we have a lot of hydroelectric power. We're like the Norwegians, right? We got mountains and we got water. So our power's pretty good. I ended up talking about this because I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners in the room? Okay, there's a few. Wow, quite a few. So we're at about 1,900, a little over 1,900 episodes of .NET Rocks, started back in 2002, where we put out a show every week talking to some luminary in the industry. We talk about stuff we think .NET developers care about. And then I also make a show called Run as Radio for more sysadmin types. I've been doing that since 2007, because starting a show for sysadmins during Vista seemed like a good idea. And so I got about 950 of those. And for a little while, we made the tablet show, and we weren't sure where tablet technology was going to go. We made it standalone, but we eventually rolled it into .NET Rocks. But this talk comes from a series of .NET Rocks episodes we call the Geek Outs. So I'm interested in a lot of stuff, and I've made all kinds of shows to sort of explore those ideas based on what the audience wanted. And so those rapidly sort of broke into three categories: space-related topics, and I'm going to do one of those Geek Outs on Friday, energy-related topics, and everything else, which is mostly like whiskey. And so I've actually done half a dozen different nuclear power-related Geek Outs, which is me mostly doing research and pulling together good information, trying to explain stuff in about an hour. It's different to put it together as a talk. So it's been good fun for me to assemble all those notes and sort of go back through and say, now, what's a cohesive hour to say when we're trying to explain nuclear power? So here we go. Let's start at the beginning. So the late 1890s, when our friends Philippe and Marie Curie, or Pierre and Marie Curie, coined the term radiation. All right, and radioactivity. So this is the beginning. They're playing with radium, which will ultimately kill them. But they're starting to learn the idea that there are some elements out there. This is still when we're building the periodic table that emit these particles. They initially called them Becquerel rays. But later we'd learn more about it. They'd actually separate out from pitch blende radium to make a reliable element that they could measure those particles from. That research furthered by a guy named Ernst Rutherford, who's a Kiwi, working in Canada. This is a photo of him from 1912 with Hans Geiger. They both developed sensors to measure radiation, hence the name Geiger counter. This is the guy. And Rutherford also coined the concept of the alpha ray and the beta ray, although today we call them the alpha and beta particles. So these are the sort of elements of radiation. After doing that work and winning the Nobel Prize in 1908, Rutherford would go on using those sensors to actually help to describe what atomic atoms looked like. Even in, just over 100 years ago, we still didn't really have a model of the atom. His most famous experiments are the experiments called the gold foil experiments, where he's using a beta particle emitter, so that is radium, to fire these relatively heavy, they're actually helium nuclei, at gold foil. And he's now got these sensors, based on the technology that he worked on with Geiger, to measure where those particles hit. And most of the time, they go straight through. So this idea, you put a sheet of gold in the way, and it went right through it. But every so often, it deflects. And once in a while, it goes the other way. So he began to put together these ideas of what we now know as the atomic model. One of his students was a guy named Niels Bohr, who also helped with this, with the Bohr model. This idea that atoms are almost entirely empty space, and that concentrated in the center is almost all of the mass. At the time, they only knew about protons, or a positively charged particle. So there's a positively charged cluster of particles in the middle. It would be another 20 years before they'd figure out what the neutron was. And surrounded by shells of electrons. And this is more of a Bohr model that I'm showing there. They are all simplification. Atoms are more complicated than this. But they are the beginning of that. And that's in the early 1900s, where we're still filling out the periodic table, and the periodic table is sorted by atomic weight, or really atomic number, which is the number of protons in the nucleus. If it has 1 proton, it's hydrogen. If it has 2, it's helium. If it's 3, it's lithium. 4, beryllium, and so on. And we get into, things get interesting when we get down in those lanthanides and actinides, which is where uranium and the other radioactives live. By the 1930s, Meitner and Frisch, and I would point out, because history has written this poorly, although we're revising it, but every single time, pretty much without a doubt, you will find both men and women working together on this science. They just keep leaving out the women's names. Okay, and there's a lot of work now going to correct history. So believe me, Lise Minter was not Otto's assistant. They were peer researchers. They were both very good at what they were doing, and they're the first to deliberately split an atom, to fission uranium into 2 other products, barium and krypton. It was a theoretical idea until these people did it in 1939 and published a paper on how it should work, and other people reproduced that example just in time for World War II. And that was actually in Germany. It's also, this was the real proof point, because they measured the amount of energy emitted in gamma rays. It proved E equals mc squared. Like, they were able to account for Einstein's paper, which he'd written in 1905. So 35 years after the guy writes the paper, they actually prove, yep, if you split an atom, you emit this much energy, and it is direct, that exact calculation of converting mass into energy. So any doubt that Einstein was a clever guy? This is the atom that they split. This is uranium-235. It's a fairly rare element. It is found in pitchblende. And so they were able to separate it off, and they collide a neutron into it. That neutron is absorbed into the atom briefly. There's a ratio of neutrons to protons that are stable, and when you add another neutron here, it destabilizes it, and it fissions. It splits into new elements. This is literally alchemy. You know, before the scientific revolution, there was this whole idea that you could transmute lead into gold, which, by the way, you cannot. But here we were actually making one element into another. In fact, one of the proofs that we were doing is by measuring the existence of these elements that previously weren't there. Krypton is naturally a gas, so in the experiment, it concentrated towards the top of the container, and you could measure that it existed. Uranium-235 is a specifically important element because in its fission, when it splits, it releases several additional neutrons. Most elements do not do this. So we call these, the ones that do, fissile elements. They're important when you want to do this when you want to make energy from rocks, to know what is fissile and what is fissionable and what is fertile. Now, uranium-235 is very rare. It's only it's about 0.7% of uranium concentrates. Normally, most uranium is uranium-238. Same number of neutrons, same number of protons. They're both 92 protons, but just more neutrons. And 238 isn't fissile. It doesn't spit out neutrons like this. So as they were experimenting, trying to do more cascading reactions, they needed to concentrate the uranium-235 out of the 238. And the technique they came up with was the vacuum distiller. So it's basically a spinning cylinder, and you pump uranium hexafluoride into it. Uranium hexafluoride, so you use fluorine, 6 fluorine atoms per uranium atom, turns it into a gas, and then you spin it inside these centrifuges. And because uranium-235 is just a teeny bit lighter than uranium-238, the 235 tends to congregate towards the top of the cylinder and the 238 towards the bottom, and then you can siphon that 235 off and increase your concentration of 235. Very useful if you wanted to make, say, a bomb. And in the 1940s, when the Manhattan Project was in full swing, that's exactly what they were doing. So this these early set of experiments in splitting the atom were controlled examples, and there was this idea that we could do a controlled process or an uncontrolled process. A controlled process would make power, and an uncontrolled process would make a bomb. And there was a group of English researchers, the MAUD committee, that wrote a set of papers, a pair of reports, primarily just for the Allies, because the war was on, that said, we can use uranium to make a bomb, and we can use uranium for power. Now, most of the stuff that the Mod Committee put together then went on to go into the Manhattan Project controlled by the Americans. And that's when you get these kinds of centrifuges, of which at Oak Ridge Labs, they built 50,000 of them to produce roughly 1 kilogram of 100% enriched uranium-235 per day. They would made 64 kilograms of it to make the little boy bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. Now, that wasn't the only process they were doing. They had also discovered, while working through this, while playing with uranium, that uranium-238 did have an interesting application. Enrico Fermi in Chicago in 1942 built the first quote-unquote nuclear reactor. Yes, there are some natural ones as well, but this was an intentional construction. He now had purified uranium available to him, so he used about 300 metric tons of graphite blocks in a basement under a stadium in Chicago, along with about 40 metric tons of uranium oxide and a little bit of uranium metal, about 4 tons of uranium metal, stacked together in different ways until they found that they could have a continuous reaction. It didn't represent a lot of energy, just a few watts, but it was controllable. The amount of uranium and where it was positioned in the pile affected the rate of reaction. And Fermi wrote about this concept called the K value. Basically, how many neutrons are being emitted, and if the number of neutrons are being emitted, gradually you get more heat and more energy. And you can moderate this with different compounds and the amount of uranium. So if you're at a K of 1, then you're basically, for every neutron emitted, another neutron is produced, and the sequence does not increase. If you're at 2, you're in danger. This happens very quickly. A good K is like 1.05. Just a little bit faster, so you can accelerate the reaction. And they used rods to reach in and pull different amounts of uranium and different compounds. They used different neutron sinks like boron they would put in there, and it would absorb neutrons, and the K value would drop, and the reaction would slow down. So a lot of learning came in 42 in this pile. But one of the biggest things that came out of it is they discovered that uranium-238 was fertile, different from fissile, but fertile, which is to say that if you hit uranium-238 with a neutron, the neutron stays. And temporarily, it becomes uranium-239, which is not stable. Now, in other atoms, you might have a fission reaction. In this case, you don't. What you instead have is a beta emission. There's too many neutrons in the nucleus, so the response is that one of the neutrons becomes a proton. So basically, a neutron is a proton and electron stuck together with a thing called a gluon, because physicists are hilarious at naming things. That breaks apart, the neutron stays in place, the electron is emitted along with a gamma ray, a photon. And now you have a new element, you've again transmuted. And so uranium becomes neptunium. Notice the names? And if you do it again, it takes a certain amount of time, so 23 minutes goes by, uranium-239 becomes neptunium-239, and then about 2 1/3 days later, another neutron breaks down, adds another proton, another beta emission, and you have plutonium-239, which is fissile, just like uranium-235 is. So the Americans, who over in Tennessee were using centrifuges to concentrate uranium-235, now built reactors similar to Fermi's in Hanford in Washington State called breeder reactors. And what they were using was they would take 4 metric tons of uranium-238 and they would cook it with neutrons over a period of time to make plutonium. It took about 4 metric tons of uranium to make 1 kilogram of plutonium. And they made about 250 grams of it a day. And it takes about 6 kilograms to make the bomb. So the Trinity device, known as the Gadget, was the first nuclear bomb made, and it was a plutonium implosion device. So they took that 6 kilograms of plutonium made in Hanford through this breeder process, concentrated and cleaned, built into a sphere. They packed explosives around it, perfectly shaped and timed so that the explosion would compress the sphere, causing a criticality event that detonated the plutonium in a very powerful explosion of about 40 metric tons of TNT. The little boy bomb, the uranium-235 bomb, was only made and used once, the one they used in Nagasaki. It was called Little Boy because it was only 10,000 pounds, so 3 metric tons. It was long and narrow. It was actually built around an 8-inch artillery shell, and they accelerated one piece of uranium-235 into the other. It was an extraordinarily dangerous bomb. The pilots of the Enola Gay were told they could not drop the bomb in the ocean because that would set it off. Water would moderate the neutrons coming from the U-35 enough that it would go off. So they were in a great deal of danger handling that bomb. Putting 65 kilograms of concentrated 235 together is essentially going to explode at any time. So everybody stopped doing that. Uranium is insanely dangerous to be used this way. But plutonium, because it needs this perfect implosion to detonate, makes it a very stable weapon. You can set it on fire. It won't go off. It'll just burn up the explosives. It'll be a radioactive fire, but it won't be an explosion. And so all nuclear weapons are made with plutonium here on out. And I talk about this because I want you to be very clear that nuclear power has its origins in the weapons. The research that went into making these systems were to make weapons. And because the uranium fuel chain produced plutonium as a byproduct, the military was very interested in it. It was incredibly expensive to make those first nuclear weapons, and they were looking for an efficient way to do it. And so they were interested in the kind of nuclear power that produced plutonium as the byproduct. Now, after the war, Admiral Rickover was interested in nuclear power, not to power homes, but to power submarines. And so in 1947, he kicked off an initiative to build a reactor small enough to fit into a submarine. He did it in Idaho because ocean? Idaho's in the mountains, but okay. But that's near the Hanford sites where a lot of the experimentation going. So he had the skilled people. They built it in a tank of water. That's the test reactor there. He actually had a working reactor in 6 years. By 1953, it was running, and by 1955, the Nautilus was built, the first nuclear submarine that famously went around the world underwater because it basically had an unlimited amount of energy available to it. It ran for decades. He was very concerned about safety. He trained his people extremely well. He set a lot of the standards for how power should be made and what their capabilities was, and the sort of discipline that was built around that. Now, the Cold War is in full swing. And so by 1953, while the new reactor is built and the Nautilus is not constructed yet, President Eisenhower has a big announcement. Now, it's important to think about the chain of events from the end of World War II, when the Americans detonate 2 weapons over top of cities and destroy them, and we start dealing with the consequences of that. And I did an entire Geek Out on this if you want to listen to it. And I was depressed for days. My wife does not like that I made that show. Like it did a number on me. But between 1945 and those initial detonations, Edwin Teller matured the thermonuclear bomb, what they call the H-bomb, which has a tertiary, secondary, and it still uses plutonium as its initial detonator, but then uses a set of reflectors to accelerate the force of the explosion to make it megatons. They got theirs working by 1952, and the Soviets followed up with their own in 1953. So the picture you're looking at here is Eisenhower addressing the UN for atoms for peace. Yes, we've done 400 nuclear explosion tests and created a new bomb 100-fold more powerful, but atoms for peace. And this really is where we talk about kicking off the atomic age, that the Americans committed funding to mature the technologies around around nuclear energy to turn it into a power source. And it yields benefits. Within a few years, the first real reactors get built. So the very first one is in 1960. It's built by Westinghouse in Massachusetts. It's a pressurized water reactor, and this is where we can walk through the fundamentals now of how light water reactors work. So the important part is to recognize there's as little innovation here as is possible. So these steam generators are these steam turbines are the same kind that are used in coal power plants. They produce about 300 megawatts of energy each. And so you need a boiler to create enough pressurized steam to run those turbines well. And you can boil water lots of different ways. You can do it with coal, and you can do it with oil, and you can do it with these funny rocks. So the way they do it with the rocks is that they build fuel assemblies, heats up the water. Water goes through a secondary exchange. Let's see if I can use the pointer for this. So there's our reactor that has the uranium in it. It heats up this water in the primary loop. That water is then going through a heat exchanger, so other water is brought in by pump, gets heated up, runs to the steam turbines. That water is then cooled back down, goes through cooling towers, and is pumped back into the system again. New water added from a local water source. This is fine. These initial reactors were not very big. This is about 180 megawatts of electricity produced. Typically, you want 300 today. They're mostly over 1,000, although that is not actually that they have huge turbines. Normally, to do a gigawatt nuclear reactor, you'd have 3 water loops on it. Each of those water loops producing between 300 and 350 megawatts each. So multiple water loops, larger reactor core. By the way, that original reactor ran from 61 to 1991, so had a 30-year run, was decommissioned, site cleaned up. Like, we don't talk about the non-dramatic versions of nuclear power, where reactors are built, operated, produce the energy for the communities, and then are dismantled and replaced. But that's exactly what happened with that particular site. The challenge with the pressurized water reactor is that you're using water in 2 ways. The one is that you're using it to moderate the nuclear reaction. When neutrons are released from fissile material like uranium-235, they're moving extremely fast. In fact, physicists cleverly have called them fast neutrons. The problem with fast neutrons is while they hit atoms really hard, they don't hit atoms very often. And so you need a high neutron flux to reliably have fission reactions going on. Or you slow the neutrons down. So you put a moderator between the reactive material and other reactive materials. And there are a number of different moderators. Graphite can be used as a moderator, beryllium can be used as a moderator, but for these reactors, it's water. So the neutrons that exist in the oxygen atoms of the water act as the moderator. The high-speed neutrons hit the water, and they kick out a new neutron at a lower energy rate. They call it a thermal neutron. Thermal neutrons move slower, so they cause more fission reactions, about 600 times more. So you can run at a lower neutron flux and rate of emissions because you get better yields from your neutrons. But the behavior is different. It's easier for us to have the fission products to produce plutonium. Also, the water is used as what's called the working fluid. It's where the heat goes. So you need to take the heat and move it through pumps to other water that hasn't been exposed to radioactive materials that then can be converted to steam. But 100 degrees centigrade is not enough energy to make the steam turbine run well. You need about 300 degrees, and so you need to pressurize the water. Right? We put that water under enough pressure that it can carry enough energy to make the steam turbines work well. And this is not innovative technology. This is how steam railroad engines work. This is how other power plants work, that you pressurize the water. And so they basically duplicated the behavior. It's just that you have this bomb in this pressure vessel filled with radioactive actinides. So it has its challenges. And you're combining 2 roles, both moderation and working fluids are the same thing, which makes it more complicated when things go wrong. The reactor vessel is a complicated device. There's fuel assemblies in the center of it in all of these bars here. This is where the fuel actually lives. Water is brought in on this side, flows down the side here, comes up, goes through the cores. Where it gets hot, it exits through these holes and back out the nozzle on this side. That's the essence of it. At the bottom, there's a set of instruments. That's where we do the measurements from. At the top are the control rods. The control rods typically made of graphite or boron. They are neutron absorbers, and they slow down the reaction by soaking up the neutrons so the K values drop. Reaction goes a bit slower. You notice the stud bolts? These stud bolts are here because occasionally you have to refuel the reactor, and so you need to open that chamber up and lift those fuel assemblies out. Typical run time for a contemporary pressurized water reactor is 18 to 24 months. So inside that core are these fuel assemblies. Each of these fuel assemblies is a 16 by 16 matrix, 4 to 5 meters long. So you have about up to 200 of these assemblies per core in a reactor, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 80 metric tons. Inside each of one of those assemblies are these individual fuel pellets. There's about 400 of them per rod assembly, then combined together into the 16 by 16 matrix, and then a group of them assembled into a core. When you want to refuel something so radioactive that it will immediately kill you if you get anywhere near it, you use cranes and water. So typically in a pressurized water reactor, the vessel is opened up from the top, a refueling bridge comes in from above, the entire chamber is filled with water. The crane comes through, reaches through the water, picks up an individual fuel assembly, pulls it out. They pull it off to the side here to this area they call the fuel transfer tube. They lay that fuel assembly on its side. It is moved by conveyor into the fueling building where they are picked up and sorted and restacked. Typically in each refueling cycle for a reactor of this scale, your typical gigawatt reactor, you'll replace 1/3 of the fuel assemblies with each refueling every 2 years. And so the oldest ones will be taken out and they'll be put for reprocessing. The second oldest and third oldest will be shuffled around. They get moved towards the outside, and the newest fuel gets put more towards the center. You add new fuel in, and then you reload and you run again every couple of years doing refuelings. And so you end up with these cooling ponds filled with core assemblies in various states of cooling. Just because you're not running a reaction anymore, those rods stay hot for months. And so it takes a while to get them cool enough to be able to do things with them. Now, after you've run fuel for up to 6 years inside of a reactor, because every 24 you're doing refueling, so the fuel's about 6 years old, it's changed, it's transmuted. You've hit it with a bunch of neutrons, so a certain amount of those elements have changed. You went in with a concentration of, or what they call 4% enriched uranium. Natural uranium is only 0.7%, so you've enriched it up to about 4%, the rest is 238. You've now run it for 6 years. So 3% of that initial weight is now plutonium. And remember, the military was very interested in this part, right? It was key. You started with a 50-ton core. You've done your 6 years of run of about 1/3 of it, which is about 16 metric tons. That's what you lift out of the reactor to reprocess. You've made about 160 kilos of plutonium, all right? Roughly enough for 40 bombs. Good one. And then most of the fuel is still intact, right? You started with 6% uranium-238. Now you're down to 93%. So you can just put that back in your reactor, more or less. There's still some uranium-235 left. Some of the plutonium's contaminated, so you have to do other things with it. And you have this thing called 5% fission products. So those are the things of where the U-35 broke down and became other elements. And that depends on any given interaction in the atom. I talked about one of the interactions of uranium-235, which is the barium-krypton split. But there's a bunch of others. And there are charts made to figure this out. So you have the overall mass of a U-235 atom there at the bottom. On average, the split is about 118, okay? Which actually never happens. It's offset there. This particular impact shows us breaking into xenon-140 and strontium-94, neither one of which is a particularly stable atom, and so they have decay chains. So this impact created a xenon, which had a beta decay in 14 seconds, becomes cesium, which then had a beta decay after 64 seconds to become barium, which has a beta decay after 13 days. See how it's getting longer? To lanthanum, beta decays after 40 hours to become cesium, or cerium, which is stable. On the other side, the strontium breaks down to yttrium and then to zirconium, which is stable as well. There are about 40 or 50 different variations on this theme. So when we say fission products, it's a lot of stuff. And some of it can be radioactive for quite a while, and some of it not that long. You saw some of the total decay time here is about 2 weeks for all of this to more or less be stable. And so those fission products are then put, the entire fuel assembly that was removed is put through processing to get that uranium-238 and the 235 back, separate off the plutonium, and manage the fission products. These processes are extremely complicated. This is the PureX one. It is a summarization. I don't want to explain the whole thing because I don't even understand it all. But you have fuel coming in on this side, being dismantled. Some of the stuff is gases. We get xenon and krypton, and we want to filter that off. It's part of the biggest problem you have with fuel rod assemblies is that they're transmuting pieces of it into gas, and they're inside of a ceramic. That's bad for the ceramic. And the one thing you don't want for a fuel rod is for it to crumble, because then it'll fall to the bottom of the containment vessel and not be properly spaced for the reaction. So you want to keep your fuel rods intact, but they do tend to crack from these gases being produced. So in the reprocessing, they separate the gases off. They then fluorinate the actinides. So clever trick happens when you take a solid fuel rod and you grind it up and then you pump it full of fluorine. You make, if it's uranium, it becomes uranium hexafluoride, which is a gas at room temperature. That also works for plutonium, it works for neptunium, and a bunch of the other actinides. So you do this initial fluorinization, all of your actinides separate off. You then pump that gas away, defluorinate it, and you have uranium and plutonium that you can put back into fuel rods. The stuff that wouldn't actually become a gas is now the set of radioactive elements that you need to decay out and sort and potentially sell or store. This Purex process is actually a French process. The Americans no longer reprocess fuel. They stopped in the 1970s. Why? Politics. So in the 1970s, Gerald Ford, who's the only unelected president of the United States, right? He became the vice president of the U.S. when Spiro Agnew was indicted and had to step down. And then Nixon was indicted and stepped down, and suddenly Gerald Ford is president. So in 1976, he's running to actually be elected as president against a guy named Jimmy Carter. He loses. But one of the things that Carter was on about was stopping nuclear proliferation. And they sort of zoomed in on this fuel reprocessing process. This is where the plutonium comes from. If we stop this, we stop proliferation of nuclear weapons. And Ford's answer to that is, okay, let's stop fuel reprocessing then. So it was done purely as a political stunt to just stop fuel reprocessing. But when Carter won, a couple of years later, he passed it into law, and the Americans have never reprocessed fuel ever again. Now, which means that every core they've taken out since 1977, sitting in a cooling tank nearby their reactors. Hundreds of them. And they're mostly usable fuel. The ones that sit for long enough, it takes a couple of years, if they get completely cold, they actually entomb them and store them. But they've stopped reprocessing fuel, even though there's more fuel there. Now, there's some economic incentives here too. In the early 60s, when they were first making these reactors, uranium was relatively scarce, and the need to breed new fuel was important, and reuse fuel was also important. But by the 70s and 80s, with the oil crisis kicking off the exploration boom, uranium became much more available. The Canadians have a ton of it. The Australians have a bunch of it. Like, there's a lot of uranium around. So just making new fuel rods was simple, and they could not bother with the reprocessing step. And they've done that ever since. Now, that's not true in France, where to this day they reprocess their fuel. In fact, the French are clever enough that they've learned to just add the plutonium back to the fuel rod, what they call a mixed oxide fuel rod. So they're using up their plutonium in their reactors. It has its other problems, but that's what they've done. And since we're talking the 1970s, we might as well talk about the accidents. So let's start with 3 Mile Island. And I've been asking around, depending on your age, you may not have any memory or any knowledge of 3 Mile Island. It's not the first major nuclear accident. One could argue that Windscale was the original one in the UK, but very few people know about that one. This one certainly had a big impact on nuclear power worldwide. So this is a plant in the US. During the 1970s, there's 2 reactors in it. They're pressurized water reactors, about 800 megawatts each, although the second one's slightly bigger than the first one. It's closer to 900. And during the accident in 1979, reactor 1 was shut down for refueling, right? Every 2 years, you do that refueling cycle. Reactor 2, which is the one you can see right there. These are cooling towers. They have no radiation in them, just water. That is the reactor. It is a concrete bunker designed to resist impact from an aircraft, right? They are armored containers, those primary pressure vessels, or the secondary pressure vessel around it. So TMI-2 is running, that's 3 Mile Island, reactor 2, is running at 97% capacity. It's cranking electricity out. There had been some maintenance problems. This reactor, this is only what they consider a Generation 2 reactor. That one from the 1960s being a Generation 1 reactor where they're just figuring things out. It has a few more automated safety features, but it still has some problems. And it's pretty much new. It had only come online the previous year. So they're still knocking the bugs out of it, and there's some training problems. So some maintenance had been done on the system that actually confused some instruments. And so on that day in 1979, there's a fault. The fault is a sensor thinking there's not enough water in this primary feed loop that feeds the water into the heat exchanger where they make the steam to run the turbine. And so this pump shuts off, thinking it's going to get damaged if it doesn't shut off. That stops the water flow through here, right? Now there's no water, that means no steam coming in the turbine, so to stop the turbine from getting damaged, the turbine shuts down. It's called a turbine trip. And this happens, of course, at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? So it's the third team towards the end of their shift. Their shift ends at 6 a.m. when suddenly the turbine shuts down. Because you no longer have that steam being pumped out, you're not taking heat off the reactor loop anymore. So immediately the reactor loop starts heating up quickly. A bubble forms in the pressurizer. That's this piece here that's supposed to keep the pressure even in this line. So as that pressure, as the steam starts to concentrate up there, it goes up to 155 bar. That's a lot of pressure. It's 2,000 plus pounds per square inch. And that kicks off an emergency to relieve that pressure. There's a valve here called the PROV valve. It pops open to relieve pressure into this tank. In a few seconds, this happened in seconds. It's gone this far. The pressure continues to go up, enough that it trips 165 bar, which is emergency threshold. It scrams the reactor. The control rods are automatically dropped into the reactor core. It goes from 90% operating power to 6, which basically as slow as it can go. There's still a lot of heat in the system, but it's been immediately shut down. Emergency pumps kick in to add additional feed water into the system. They're part of this loop here. It's not on the picture, but they're there. But tests the previous day had cut off those pumps from being able to feed the system. So the pumps turn on, but they can't move any water, and nobody in the control room notices that those valves are locked. So still no water being added to the system. However, because the reactor has been scrammed and is starting to cool down, the pressure drops enough that the pour valve is ordered to close. It just doesn't actually close, and nobody knows. It turned out that the company that built the reactor wired a sensor to the solenoid of the valve. The pour valve was notorious for sticking. And so in development of it, they said, hey, we have a problem with this valve sticking. Can you give us an indicator light to tell us when the valve is open or closed? That's not what they did. What they did was they wired it to the solenoid that makes it close, so that if it is closed, the light turns off, and if it's open, then the light turns on, except that it only measures the voltage across the solenoid. So the solenoid releases, which should close the valve, the light turns off, but the valve's still open. And so there's still water in the form of steam coming out that and going into the pressure relief tank. All right. It's going to take a few hours for them to realize that valve is there. So now the water, we're losing water from the pressure vessel, right? And so in theory, with this reactor scram, we should see the pressure be going down and the water going down as well, because you should be losing steam. But because that valve's still open, it won't hold pressure, and the steam is, while the temperature's down, the water level's rising. So you're having this opposite thing where the pressure's dropping, the water level's going up. And the operators are freaked out. That just makes no sense. How could the water level still be going up if the pressure's going down? Because they don't realize the pour valve is open. So they shut off these pumps, the main reactor coolant pumps, because what they're afraid of is that the water level's filling up in the reactor, and if it completely fills up so there's no expansion space left, you'll lose flow. There's an argument in the post of this whole thing that if they had done nothing, if they had just sat on their hands, fewer problems would have happened. So they shut off the primary loop, thinking convection will control the system, not knowing they're losing water. Then the shift change comes in. The shift change comes in, and those guys go and look at other sets of sensors which are not immediately visible to the crew that was sitting at the desks and realize the pour valve is open. So they actually close it at that time. Now it's 6 o'clock in the morning. That's why it's shift change. Now the question is how much water is left in the reactor vessel, and they don't know because they haven't been able to keep track. And the sensors that would measure water in the pressurized water tank have failed. So now they're not sure how hot the reactor core is, and they feel like they need to pump more water into it, right? Now that it's actually sealed up, but they're afraid it's so hot, if they pump water into it, it will explode. Which actually means if they want to pump water into it, they need to open the valves up to allow the steam to escape and slowly add water to it. And this is the point where it overflows the pressurized relief tank and goes into the secondary containment vessel and starts setting off radiation alarms. Now they finally have what they now believe they have a coolant loss event, and that's actually triggers the emergency procedures, the ones that virtually nobody knew. So they report very poorly into their government that they have this problem now. They have pressure building up in the primary containment vessel, and they're afraid to pump water in. So it won't be until about 11 o'clock in the morning that they'll finally, about 8 o'clock in the morning, they'll get enough confidence now to start pumping water in the system with the valves on to allow the reactor building to handle the pressure, start cooling the reactor down. In hindsight, they realized by 6 a.m. the reactor was exposed and beginning to melt. With its control rods in, so you couldn't take them out even if they wanted to, and it wouldn't be until about 11 o'clock in the morning, pumping just tens of thousands of gallons through the system, they cool and stabilize the reactor to be able to close it off. More or less, event over. Along the way, there may have been a hydrogen explosion. Nobody's really sure. When cores overheat, the zirconium cladding around the uranium disintegrates, and as it does that, it makes hydrogen, and sometimes that hydrogen explodes. There's evidence there may have been an explosion, but not enough to breach the containment vessel. They did have some gas release while that containment vessel is starting to pressurize, as they're adding more water to it. They have to burp the pressure off. They don't want to break the primary containment vessel, so there's some krypton gas was released. There's never been any evidence, actually provable, that there was any meaningful radiation emitted from 3 Mile Island. But the core was irrevocably damaged. The top part of it was exposed. It's considered a partial meltdown. As those uranium oxides start to melt, they fall through the containment vessel and they pile up at the bottom. The bottom of that containment vessel, there's about 12 metric tons of the core, which now is no longer spaceable, right? You can't put control rods into it. So they have to keep pumping water through the system. They add boron to the water to help reduce the neutron flux for a couple of years to actually allow the materials to break down. Now, admittedly, without a lot of control and without a lot of intentionality, this was a contained event, relatively speaking. And they did ultimately dismantle this entire reactor, remove all of the radioactive materials, and dispose of it. The other reactor on the site was recommissioned in 1985 and continued to run up until 2019. So, but the tone was changed. This is when America generally soured on nuclear reactors. There's been a big push to commission more nuclear reactors in the U.S. during the energy crisis, when they thought there's a limited amount of oil, but we can make this up in nuclear power, let's go. And they planned a lot of reactors, many of which didn't get built. But then these incidents start to happen, and it scares people. Movies are made. You know, the facts are not as dramatic, but the facts take a year to come out. In the meantime, people are frightened. There's been a whole TV series made about Chernobyl, so I don't have to go into too much detail. We're only going forward about 7 years. This is April of 1986. It's towards the end of the Cold War. The Chernobyl site's in Ukraine. There's actually 4 reactors there. They are RBMK type reactors. These are graphite moderated reactors as opposed to water moderated, although they do use water as the working fluid. So they use it to generate steam to turn turbines, but they use graphite as the moderator. They are somewhat of an older design. Only the Russians use this type of reactor design. They still use it to this day. There are actually 4 reactors on the Chernobyl site. 2 of them are still in use, so they were up until the war. And on that, there's again, incredibly complex story about there was actually a test that needed to be run for certification of reactor number 3. They were supposed to run the test during the day with the A team, but there was a delay because of power limitations due to the problems in the Soviet Union. So they pushed it off to the night shift, so it was half staged in the morning. A bunch of mistakes were made. They try to run it at night. They rush through it. They botch it. And they blow a 50 metric ton nuclear core through the countryside. Would not recommend. It's as bad can get. You blew the roof off the core, off of the containment vessel entirely. A bunch of people died immediately. Many more died of radiation exposure over the next few weeks. The first crew of firefighters that showed up didn't realize there was a radioactive core on the ground. They picked pieces of it up and said, wow, this is hot. And I taste metal, right? All of those people died. Admittedly, eventually there were people who knew what they were in for, who knew they had to clean up all this material, toss it back in the hole, and so would wear as much radiation protection as they could and work in minute-long shifts to run out, take a shovelful and throw it in the hole and run back. Aircraft flying overhead, pouring sand in the reactor. They worked for days and days. There were a lot of heroes in Chernobyl. And eventually, by the end of that year in '86, they built this sarcophagus around that. For better or worse, their main motivation here was to make the site safe enough to continue to use the other reactors. This was designed to last for 30 years, and it more or less did. By 2017, we've built a new containment vessel, which is so large it's over top of the old one, so they can actually dismantle the old one. We now have better technologies to clean these things up. But all of this has been put on hold as of February of 22 with the invasion into Ukraine, although Chernobyl got an opportunity to kill again when a group of Russian soldiers with an officer who decided that his people weren't working hard enough, decided that they needed to dig trenches along the roadside with the locals saying, that will kill you. Everyone in that platoon dies of radiation poisoning. There's still enough cesium-137 in the ground around Chernobyl 40 years later that you're dead in days if you dig that stuff up. All right, one more, Fukushima. 2011, the Sendai earthquake and tsunami. There are actually 6 reactors at Fukushima. They are numbered very sensibly. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, this is 5, and this is 6. Numbers are hard. At the time of the earthquake, 1 through 3 were running. 5 was in a refueling, and 4 and 6 were cold. They didn't need to run at the time. Normal protocol during an earthquake is to scram all reactors. This makes a lot of sense. Reactor damage happens over time during earthquakes, so the moment you can sense it, if you can get the control rods down in the reactor, there's a possibility that the earthquake could damage those control systems, and you wouldn't be able to drop those rods, so get them down as fast as possible. These are all Generation 2 reactors, much like the other ones. These are boiling water reactors instead of pressurized water reactors. The difference is not wildly important. So same thing, they've been running at full power, now they're scrammed, so they're down to 5-6%. They have a lot of byproduct heat that is going to take a while to cool down, and they don't have any electricity anymore because you just shut down all of your reactors. So there are emergency generators that fire up to pump the water to continue to cool the reactors. That was fine, worked perfectly, everything's normal. 50 minutes later, a 14-meter high wave of water arrives at Fukushima, overtopping the 5-meter high seawall that nobody thought could ever be breached by almost triple. It actually makes it all the way past the reactor. Those reactor rooms are sitting at about 10 meters up. That's a fairly hefty slope there. The generators were actually down in the lower part, so bunch of generators here got swamped. There were battery packs further back, they got swamped. There were actually some generators up here and in other battery systems up here, but all their controllers were down here, so they all went underwater, which is to say all of the cooling backup systems failed within a few minutes of the tsunami coming through. It killed 2 crew members on the ground. It made a huge mess. You saw how much damage these tsunamis cause. And so, but the team worked continuously to try and get some cooling working there. They had a lot of procedures. They just weren't prepared for this big of a wipeout. And other pumps were brought in. But the reality is that the reactors, as soon as they didn't have water flowing, they built up steam bubbles. They were uncovered within a few minutes and began to melt. And that kicks off hydrogen concentrations. So March 11th is the reactor driven. By 12, by the second day, we had the first of 3 hydrogen explosions. So this was reactor 1 that had uncovered first, so it had the largest hydrogen concentration. I want to make a distinction here that this is a hydrogen explosion versus a steam explosion. Right? Steam and water have a lot more force and energy. These were significant explosions, enough that the first explosion actually damaged a bunch of the backup pumping systems that had been brought in and sent all the crews running for cover, but they didn't blow the building apart. They blew panels out of it. It looks more dramatic than it actually was. But there were 3 of them, a day or so apart, as each of the reactors had built up enough hydrogen to cause these explosions. And each of those explosions also represent a certain level of radiation emission as well. At one point, they had to evacuate the crews that were at the reactor site because the radiation levels were high enough that it was problematic, and skeleton crews were continuing to operate there. All three of the reactors that were running breached their pressure vessels, and the thorium landed in the primary containment vessel and stayed there, fortunately. They eventually switched to seawater to cool that because it's thorium, it's concentrated, so it stays hot for a long time. They are still pumping water in Fukushima 13 years later. And they're storing all that water on site. So the Japanese intend to clean this entire mess up, as they are, diligent that way. And so they continue to pump water over radioactive materials. That water, now contaminated, is pumped through a series of scrubbing systems that remove all the radioactives from it. And then they store the water. They got a 1.2 million metric tons of water in storage on the site. In the early days, there was almost 800 metric tons of water involved. They pumped 400 into the reactor site, plus there's about 400 metric tons coming out of the ground at the same time. All of that water picked up, put into tanks, and processed. By 2016, they built a freeze wall. They buried a set of pipes around the cores and used about 8 megawatts of electricity to drop the temperature on that ground to -30. That dropped the groundwater down to less than 100 metric tons per day. So they decreased the amount of water flowing that way. The cores are still hot, water's still being managed. They've cleaned the water sufficiently that they're ready to start releasing that water. There's big controversy over that. The only thing that's left in the water that's radioactive is a compound called tritium. Tritium is hydrogen with 2 neutrons. So normally hydrogen has no neutrons. If it has 1 neutron, it's deuterium. If it has 2, it's tritium, and it has a half-life of 12.3 years. And so that means for a given concentration of tritium, half of it will lose its neutron and become deuterium in 12.5 years. So that's roughly one cycle that's happened so far. Tritium is naturally occurring. Almost every nuclear reactor emits a certain amount of it. So there's a pretty strong case for being able to release this back into the ground, because the alternative is these tanks start to fail, and we have a much larger disaster on our hands. And so the atomic energy commissions of the world have largely acknowledged this is the right thing to do, pump the water in, but it's still a lot of people upset about this. As terrifying as all this is, nuclear power is still the safe thing. Coal kills far more people. Oil kills far more people. I think this is the car crash versus the airplane crash problem. Airplane crashes make the news because they're so rare. We talk about them, but you're in way more danger driving the airport than flying, right? There are power plant accidents almost every week somewhere in the world, right? Coal's the big killer. This is an incident called in 2008, the Kingston fossil plant slurry drop, where a couple of million tons of fly ash slurry from the power plant broke through its dikes and flooded a kilometer and a half of land, killing everything. No people died, but the sites were destroyed, and the cleanup actually killed a bunch of folks because fly ash is toxic. Oh, and radioactive. Scrubbing systems have helped improve a lot of this stuff, so there's less fly ash these days, but coal is still coal. Back in 2010, an oil and gas combined cycle plant during a test in Connecticut exploded, killing crews. And just earlier this year at a hydroelectric plant in Italy, there was a turbine explosion killing 7 and flooding a control room. Making electricity is dangerous. Nuclear power is not the dangerous version. But all power systems could be safer, and there is a way to make nuclear power safer. And there's a bunch of other reactor designs that are possible here. And I have to move quickly through this. Molten salt, this is not molten salt reactor, this is what they call a fast reactor. So get rid of the water, get rid of the pressure. So now we use liquid sodium. We use the fast neutrons, so we need a high neutron flux. It's really good at burning up actinides. It runs very hot, hundreds of degrees centigrade, so it's good. It can make energy fairly efficiently, but it's very hard to work with liquid sodium. You can't see through it. You can't clean it up. It can't be exposed to air or it burns. There's about 20 variations of the reactor that's been built since Hanford. Since World War II, they've been experimenting with this design of reactor, and they've never got them stable enough to build more of them. Another alternative, let's put the moderator into the fuel. So this is called a pebble bed reactor. So now I take the uranium and I encase it in a graphite sphere about the size of a tennis ball. So now I don't need water as the moderator. I don't have to separate the moderator from the fuel. They're combined. So the reactor itself is completely dry. You just have these balls that heat up, and when they heat up, they expand, which slows down the reaction. So they're kind of self-moderating, but they run at a very high temperature, 800, 900 degrees centigrade. So your working fuel, a fluid would be helium gas. You superheat helium gas and then use secondary conversion to turn that against water to turn steam or even molten salts. The problem with the pebble beds is they jam up. You're trying to move those cores through, and so they create dust that's dangerous and explosive, and it's hard to reprocess the fuel. So there's a couple of, China has built one of these. It doesn't look like they're building any more. Molten salt reactors. The Oak Ridge Laboratories, same guys who had all the centrifuges, built some early versions of these in the 1960s, and they've largely abandoned them. The advantage with a molten salt reactor is you're using uranium tetrafluoride. So you're now making a liquid uranium salt, which means the gases naturally bubble out of it, so you don't have the xenon and krypton problems. And it's a fluid at a very large temperature range, about 300 degrees to 1200 degrees centigrade. You want to operate at around 600, 700. So at the bottom of the containment vessel, you put a freeze plug. So this little freeze plug here melts at about 1200 degrees centigrade. And then the fluid runs out into tanks where it'll cool down naturally. That fluid is moderated by graphite, so if you get away from the graphite, the reaction just stops. They call it walk-away safe. It's a pretty stable way to do things. It runs very hot, so it makes steam like nobody's news. It also opens the door to not just using uranium, but using thorium. And you may have heard thorium molten salt reactors. The thorium is fertile the same way uranium-238 is fertile. You add a neutron to it, it has a cascade that eventually becomes uranium-233, and that's what you run in your reactor because uranium-233 is fissile. So it produces more neutrons. So we talk about a thorium reactor, but it's actually running uranium. You can make molten salt reactors out of uranium, people have, right? And again, the Chinese have a uranium molten salt reactor running today. Interesting thing about these molten salt reactors is that you don't have to refuel them by shutting them down. This reprocessing step here, you can actually add new fuel to it continuously. Now, I could show you the entire process of breaking down molten salt fuels. I love this slide. I can almost read this slide. I'm not going to read it to you today. But remember I mentioned that idea of uranium hexafluoride being a gas? So you've got this uranium fluoride salt. It's reacting, so it's breaking stuff down. It's making krypton, it's making barium, it's making molybdenum, a bunch of other elements, right? You're doing transmutation. Now you run it through our reprocessing cycle where you gasify it. All of the actinides, uranium, neptunium, plutonium, all of them become a gas. The rest is not. You then take that gas, turn it back into the fuel, put it back into the system. And now you can do reprocessing on the rest of the materials. But more importantly, you can keep burning the actinides over and over and over again. So you'll actually burn up most of the radioactives. Where these unprocessed cores the Americans need to be stored for 10,000 years, you're talking about the byproducts of molten salt reactors only needing about 300 years. So a lot more practical of a design, safer and more efficient. So why aren't we building them? Because they don't make weapons. And the military is what's funded this whole thing the whole time anyway. And power companies don't fund anything, right? They're in the job of making reliable systems that run for years. It's up to us to get the funding for it. This is what governments need to do if we're actually going to improve these systems. And the biggest reason that nuclear power is being ignored today is that it's expensive. The regulatory models around, because every reactor is bespoke, it's incredibly hard to build them. And so when we talk about the levelized cost of energy, reactors come in at about $200 per megawatt hour. Right? That's counting all the construction costs, operating costs, fuel costs, remediation and repair and shutdown costs over the lifespan of the reactor. It comes up much more expensive for nuclear, as it's done today, than solar, wind, hydropower, even combined cycle gas, which is now the popular way to make power when you're not worried about green stuff. So we have to reduce the cost of nuclear power if we're going to make it practical. And that's when modular nuclear reactors come in. So the current wave that's happening today is build smaller reactors. Make them standardized. You build them in a factory. They're only about a maximum of 300 megawatts, sometimes as small as 60 megawatts. Small enough that they're not capable of melting through the containment vessel. This is the new scale power module. It's a new generation reactor, so it's walk-away safe anyway, but it doesn't have enough thermal mass to melt its containment vessel. So you'd run a bunch of these in tanks on a site where they do no fuel handling. They just operate the reactors. The reactors come in to the site assembled from a truck. So your fuel handling site is away from people in a safe place where all they do is make new reactors and dismantle old ones and reprocess the fuel. And the operating sites are where people need the power, but they don't touch any of the fuel. The goal here is to get the price of nuclear down to about $60 per megawatt hour. So a third of what it currently costs, which is a heck of an aspiration. But it is happening. In Canada, at the Darlington site, they have a classic CANDU reactor. It's a heavy water reactor, which you didn't touch much about, but they have 4 reactors with about a gigawatt each. And they had cost overruns, delays in manufacturing, all of the problems that traditional nuclear have. And there's a second site, Site B, where they wanted to build 2 more reactors. And it's just this argument, it's too expensive, it's not worth it. So they tried to look at making solar there. And they can't make enough solar to make sense for the amount of power that's needed. So now they're moving to actually put in these modular reactors. So a set of these 3 megawatt reactors, 300 megawatt reactors running there, and the ground has broken. So they're actually building them. They say they'll be online by 2029, which would mean getting a reactor up and running in criticality in 6 years, which has never been done before. But the interest is pretty high because this solves the principal problem, which is low cost. Right? Get the cost of construction down, get the cost of certification down. Separate the fuel handling from the operations. So the complicated site to certify only does fuel handling and making new reactors, and then they're shipped in. Which also means that every 2 years, you don't just refuel the reactor, you replace the reactor. Which means upgrades. That reactors can keep improving. Instead of getting new reactors every 40 or 50 years, you get them every 2. So now we have a centralized facility that reprocesses the fuel, builds new reactors, and innovates on those reactor designs, and then distributes them over time, which means we could start testing some of these other reactor designs at small scale, in reasonable form, knowing we have other reactor designs already working. So there is a path forward here, but it is complicated. And I hope I'd give you some ideas of the progress that's being made. There are very smart people working on this, but the fear and confusion around nuclear power is substantial, and so it's worth educating yourself on it. I have made a set of Geek Out shows on these topics. They're a few years old, but most of that content is still absolutely relevant. Feel free to listen to them. If you go to geekout.show, it'll take you to the .NET Rocks site. You can search on nuclear, and you'll see them all. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great conference.